Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's event, and thank you for joining us. My name is Joshua Lock Moran and I'm the Deputy Curator at Bonington Gallery, part of NTU Arts, which is Nottingham Trent University's extracurricular public arts programme. This evening's event runs alongside Osheen Siva's solo exhibition Karuppu at the Gallery, which is their first international exhibition, which runs until the 4th of May. Tonight's conversation will cover themes that run through Osheen's wider practice and the exhibition at Bonington Gallery. Their inspiration from cultural aesthetics that explores speculative futures and racial identities, the use of science fiction, mythology, and religious heritage amidst their love of comic books and the vibrant soul of South India. Their artworks imagine fantastical dreamscapes whilst reclaiming and reinventing Indian folktales and myths to imagine a decolonised future. So, to introduce tonight's speakers, Osheen Siva is a multidisciplinary artist from Tamil Nadu in South India, currently based in Goa. Through the lens of surrealism, speculative fiction and science fiction, and rooted in their Dalit and Tamil heritage, Osheen imagines new worlds of decolonised dreamscapes, futuristic oases with mutants and monsters and narratives of queer and feminine power. Jelena Sofronijevic is a producer, curator, writer and researcher who makes content at the intersections of cultural history, politics and the arts. Beyond their works in print, they are the producer of Empire Lines, a podcast which uncovers the unexpected flows of empire through art, and Historicity, a new series of audio walking tours exploring how cities got to be the way they are, which was recorded in locations in London 2022 and Tokyo 2023. Nicole Thiara is co-lead of Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial and Global Studies Research Group and principal investigator on the AHRC-funded research network, writing, analysing, translating Dalit literature, and it follows on grants, on page, on stage, celebrating Dalit and Adivasi literatures and performing arts. She teaches postcolonial and contemporary literature at Nottingham Trent University. Her area of research is Dalit, Adivasi and diasporic South Asian literature, and her current research project focuses on the representation of modernity in Dalit literature. This event lasts about 1 hour, and after this introduction we will stream an artist interview from the exhibition which will last about 5 minutes, which gives an overview of the exhibition for those who haven't seen it yet. Following this, Osheen will be in conversation with Nicole and Jelena. Towards the end of their conversation, there will be a chance to ask your own questions to Osheen. If you have any questions, please pop them in the YouTube chat or email boningtongallery@ntu.ac.uk. Please note that tonight's event includes live automated closed captioning generated via Microsoft Teams, and that this may include some mistakes. Thank you for joining us this evening.
My name is Osheen Siva. I'm a multidisciplinary artist from Tamil Nadu, South India. My art practice is inspired by speculative fiction and sci-fi, and is rooted in my Dalit and Tamil heritage, so it works in the space of anti-caste ethos. I work in different mediums, murals, digital art, and more recently fine art. The show is called Karuppu, which translates to dark or black in Tamil. The show has a lot of Tamil typography, and the main theme is kind of mutation and hybridity as a metaphor to challenge the caste hierarchies, and also to kind of represent fluidity and non-binariness. The show itself has a lot of strong characters that live in this futuristic world that's kind of inspired or is weaving the threads of the past and the present, and is imagining this kind of inclusive, hopeful, and diverse future. There are particular symbolisms that are quite representative of Dalit culture. For instance, a couple of animals that are being illustrated are rats and snakes and lizards and buffaloes, which are more often kind of associated with uncleanliness or being dirty, which for me, these animals kind of represent resilience and kind of resistance from unexpected places. A lot of the characters' colors and jewelry and outfits are also inspired by Tamil culture. For instance, the jewelry is something that my grandmother had, and the patterns and the colors are kind of inspired by Vellore and Tirunnamalai, the areas in which I grew up in, and their architecture. In addition to the artworks and the tapestry, we also have the mural on the walls themselves in the gallery, and I kind of just wanted to make the viewer kind of like step into this world, and I think the mural kind of helps situate yourself as a viewer. I've also used the color blue particularly because blue is kind of representative of anti-caste movement in India. So one of the pioneers of resistant movement is Ambedkar, and blue is his favorite color. It's also the color of our flag, the Dalit flag, and also is supposed to be a symbol of the sky, which kind of represents togetherness and unity. The idea behind the top part of the mural was for it to go from kind of represent like different elements. There's fire that morphs into water, but also landscape. And there's some eye kind of symbolism that represents like creatures and humanoids. I just wanted to play around with the idea of like cyclical nature of time, but also regeneration of like environments and creatures that live within it. I think it's important for the viewers to kind of know about the structures that exist today, and perhaps a little bit more awareness around the caste system that exists. Ambedkar, for instance, is one of the key pioneers of the resistance movement. He also penned the Constitution of India, and he sort of made sure that it was illegal for you to be able to discriminate legally against lower caste people, and yet it kind of still exists even though it's illegal. And I think my work may be like an interesting way to get into it. I would like to think that it's kind of inviting and not too daunting to think about like stronger or more important structures, but you can kind of view it in a fun way, but also know that it has like multiple layers that you can perhaps if you're interested, know more about.
Hello, welcome Osheen, welcome Jelena. It's just so lovely, to be having this conversation with you. I can't wait. And I thought I'll just quickly, kickstart this conversation by Osheen, by asking you about, what caste signify work, and also how in contemporary life it's still, you feel it affects, daily life, say in a Tamil city or in Goa where you live.
Yeah, I can. Thank you for having me. Give you a little gist on what the caste system is and how it's kind of prevalent in India now. So the caste system is essentially this century-old stratification that was written in the Hindu religious scripture. It divides like the population into 4 main kind of varnas, is what it's called. And more often than not, it's divided by like the job that you do. So the top one is called savarnas, and they are usually the people that like worship God and are considered kind of like purer than the rest of the kind of sections. Dalits, are the community that I belong to, is kind of not even mentioned in the structure. They're like outside of the system that's ascribed in the religious text. And we're also, as a result, kind of assigned these like menial or seemingly menial jobs in society, like manual scavenging or funeral procession conductors and such, right? So currently in India, we have the election going on, or the election season. And for the past kind of 10 years, we've had the leader that we have now, which belongs to kind of this right-wing radical, like Hindu nationalists. And just recently I was seeing the talks that he's been given in like around India, and they've been very kind of discriminatory against like the minority groups, and it's kind of their like main way of like getting votes, essentially, to like kind of divide. And a lot of them are being divided by religion, and the caste also plays a huge role in it. So yeah, historically there's been a lot of discrimination, and it still kind of percolates to contemporary society.
Can I ask, Osheen? It's so interesting hearing you talk about the very contemporary relevance of your work, because you can see within it that there are also themes of spirituality, perhaps, and themes that draw upon religion, but don't necessarily directly reference them. And I know that in the past you've spoken about how, with spirituality in particular, the tropes often play out in the artwork. So the demons, the bad guys, are lower caste. Can you talk a bit about that and how that plays out in your practice as well, how you engage with spirituality and religion?
Yeah. So I do, one of the parts of my work that I'm really interested in exploring is reinterpreting like Hindu mythology. And a lot of Hindu mythology, their characters are either really good or really bad, right? And the evil characters are often have characteristics that are very similar to like the lower caste community in India. For instance, they're either like darker skinned, or they're we can talk about this later, but they're also like certain animals that are associated with being not the main like fierce brave ones, but are like small and under like appreciated, which are like associated with like the bad guys in mythology, right? So it's been interesting for me to kind of reinterpret and maybe introduce new characters and environments and animals into this like universe that I'm creating. Yeah, essentially kind of seeing people, places that I feel like represented in many ways. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you say it's a universe that you create, because that's exactly how it feels like, right? When one is in this exhibition space, and we'll be talking about that more later. But it really feels like a universe that you're creating, and it seems quite eclectic in many ways, right? It draws on yes, mythology, folklore, but also futurism, right? So it's an interesting mix. It's one that I'm beginning to kind of get my head around, but it's not something that I find it quite hard to understand how you draw on so many, different strands and nevertheless create something so coherent. How did that develop for you? Do you feel like you create, has it always felt like a coherent sort of universe that you were creating, drawing on mythology, maybe Dalit folklore, maybe contemporary Dalit activism, but also futurism? It's such an interesting mix.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the benefits of creating something a bit more vast is that you can keep adding on to it. You know, like you can keep continuing the journey in many ways, and they can change in like different ways, right? But I think in terms of like my work being eclectic, I think it's just the different kind of inspirations that I have. I'm like very much inspired by, I don't know, just imagining a future. And that's what I love about sci-fi and like fantasy as a genre. It has no limits, you know? Yeah. Does that answer the question?
I think it's so interesting as well, because in a very sort of Western European art historic context, sci-fi is often seen and used as something that's quite dystopic. Whereas for you, I feel like when I see your works, I'm thinking about sci-fi as something that's quite hopeful, quite limitless, like you said, this tool of imagining alternative realities.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know that you draw quite a lot on speculative fiction as well. And I feel like there's a few people on this call who are big fans of Octavia Butler. But could you talk a bit about some of your interests in literature, perhaps too?
Yeah. I mean, one of my major influences in kind of doing this genre, I think, of Dalit futurism was mainly because of Afrofuturism. I got introduced to it like a while ago now. But what was interesting for me was to see kind of the African diaspora and just people being represented and imagined in the future. And I thought that was kind of missing, or I was interested in working towards that in my own like history, and seeing how my history and culture could be like imagined in the future, right? So that's what I like about kind of this speculative fiction space. I also, yeah, you're right. There is a lot of like dystopian kind of cyberpunk vision of the future, but for me, I like to operate under what's called like hope punk. See like hope, but also like revolution and like resilience in the future, right? And what I particularly like about Octavia Butler's work is that it works a lot. It explores a lot of like hybridity, which I kind of incorporate in my work as well, because I feel like it's a great way of breaking the binaries that are supposedly kind of established, right, or exist now. And also, of course, looking at the past and seeing how, if something could have changed then and how it would affect now, and how then the future could have been like changed, like alternate histories, that space as well.
And could you talk maybe a bit then about Cosmonadu? Because I know that was drawing a lot on thinking about what India might have been like with technology during the pre-colonial period, but also drawing in these amazing historic archives of Maharaja and Maharani.
I mean, India is a relatively new country, right? We've gone through a lot of history, a lot of colonization. And for me, it was interesting to see what would have been if not, right? And technology, in a lot of ways, can be democratic. It's so pervasive that it kind of like breaks through all stratas, more or less. And I think it's just important to kind of use that as a tool of like, it could be used as for good, you know. It could be used as an equaling kind of tool. Cosmonauta was one of my first ventures into this world of speculative fiction, and what attracted me the most was kind of the creatures that the characters that existed in history, like Rajas and Ranis, and how they could have made like different decisions or changed the course of history if they were more kind of, so to speak, advanced or used technology in different ways.
Maybe this is a good time for us to see some of the works. Maybe we can pull up some of the works while we're talking so you can see them. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Cosmonaut, I'm not sure we can pull up now, but it's on my website.
Yeah.
But
just
it's
some of the
really
other work.
interesting.
Yeah.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, because it's kind of cyborgy as well, but I think especially the futurism, it's not always that straightforward, right? The relationship to the past, and because the past is often a space that can be quite full of anguish, right? And whereas with Afrofuturism, it might be quite easy to potentially draw on, say, pre-colonial, pasts, pre-colonial narratives and pre-colonial ideas. But with Dalit histories, you wouldn't even quite necessarily know, that where do you go back to? Yeah,
Exactly.
When was it better, right? So in some ways, I think it's always, the way a lot of also Dalit literature draws on the past, it's always already a reimagination, right? A reinvention, which is, I think, what makes it really quite strikingly different to, from Afrofuturistic ideas and approaches. Feel that it's the way you engage with the past feels quite distinct, because in some ways Dalit histories are quite distinct.
Yeah, I mean, the caste system is so arbitrary. It's not very you can't like slide up or down, so to speak. You're kind of born into it, so it's just assigned to you at birth, and yeah, it's weird.
I know that you've also spoken before about your kind of engagement with other pop culture. Like, I think something that's really clear in your works is your love of comic books in particular, and like even if you think about TV shows like Futurama, things like that.
Yeah.
And I wondered, because I know that you read a lot of comics growing up, with respect to questions that always come up around themes of representation, for instance, how much your practice is also informed from a wanting to see yourself, or perhaps just plural selves, other selves being represented in these works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, having spoken about Afrofuturism being one of the oldest kind of these subaltern futurisms that have existed, only until recently have they even been like acknowledged or shown in the mainstream, like just after Black Panther, right? Or like mainstream, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a very slow gradual kind of emergence of these spaces, but I feel like there's a lot of like commonalities between minority movements, right, and like places around the world. Like there's Latin futurism and there's indigenous futurism, Adivasi futurism are one of the talks earlier. We're talking to the artist Subhash, who works in that space. It is definitely kind of emerging, and it's easy to see like kind of the intersections between these things. Yeah,
I think there's something really generative and really constructive about, rather than thinking about any given futurism, to think about futurisms and the constellations between them. I know that you very modestly just pointed out that talk with Subhash, but it's a really fantastic lecture / conversation that I'm sure that we can link in the notes to this, so that people can see it. But this was another talk that took place with Bonington Gallery with the artist Subhash Tebi Limbu, who's from East Nepal.
Whose work I love. It's amazing.
And it's really, I mean, I was really fortunate. I went to Venice last week and I saw one of his films being screened as part of an Asia Forum event. And it was so interesting. Again, there was some other films screened as part of the program, visually completely different, but thinking about those constellations and those networks that take place in a way entirely independent from the Western European context in which sometimes they're exhibited, I wondered if you, like your relationship as well with various institutions, and we'll come on later to talk about public art in particular, but you exhibit internationally and you also do a range of kind of commercial commissions as well. If you wanted to maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I try to. It's always nice to show to like a different audience, and I think there's a very evident rise of creatives in India that I can speak of that have been working in this anti-caste space over the years in many different forms, right? There's like musicians, rappers, especially that are up and coming in this anti-caste like music scene. There's literature, there's writers and like artists. And so it's very cool to see that the space itself is being explored more in like different areas of the world. Yeah, sorry, you were asking about commercial projects?
Yeah, as well. And just, I suppose, the balance between all of these different media in which you work.
Yeah.
Maybe
I mean,
also a good opportunity for us to see some of it so that we can.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also come from, interesting that you asked about the aesthetics of my work. I think it also comes from the fact that I worked as like a graphic designer before doing this now. So I'm quite, I think that kind of like percolates into how I see like layers and compositions for the work that I do now. It also comes from kind of this illustration digital space. So I think mediums are just, I don't know, I see mediums as just tools. Like there are different ways in which you can like implement your one kind of identity, but it definitely is inspired by like old school comic books. Like Jack Kirby, for instance, plays a huge role in like me figuring out the kind of line strokes and inking that you do in comic books. Charles Burns was another major influence. I also grew up watching like animation like Akira and Ghost in the Shell and, you know, cartoons like Futurama, like you mentioned before, and Jetsons and all these like sci-fi stuff, right? So those definitely do play a role in the visual language that I've kind of created now.
I think, yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Studio Ghibli as well. I think and we talked when I came to visit your exhibition about how in some respects in your more recent works, you feel like that line is getting darker in a way, like almost becoming more, playing more into those tropes around cartoon and play perhaps within that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just the fact that I'm getting, or I would like to think that I'm getting more and more confident in my own like style. I think like most of us, when we start out, we try to emulate like our influences and or combine like many different like influences that you might have. But I think the fact that they're just getting more bolder is just me being more comfortable with what I do in general and like kind of honing into the specific kind of like style, I think. Yeah.
And I mean, I think that was so obvious when I watched you paint the mural at Nottingham Trent University. It was just amazing, you know. There we were chatting with you, and you were just those brush strokes, you know, they just seemed so natural. It was almost like an extension of you. There you were, you know, you couldn't be distracted. You know, there were students bustling around you. The people were going through the rooms that were part of your mural, right? Because it was teaching happening at the same
time.
But there you were, you know, creating this work, and it felt like you're really, you know, you're really confident in your vision, and I feel this is reflected in the kind of characters you create. They seem incredibly confident, right? They're strong, they're beautiful, and as I said, I find them really comforting. But at the same time, it could also go the other way, right? I mean, they also look quite scary, you know, in some ways, you know, because sometimes they're these hybrid creatures. Sometimes they really seem to be well armed. Sometimes they seem to be gigantic. Sometimes you just don't quite know, as you said in a kind of a previous conversation. They might be they might not be just human figures. They might actually be that look like humans and so on, right? Or like ovaries, for that matter. So how do you, I don't know, yes, do you specifically try to create them in this kind of larger than life style, or has that just gradually emerged and you're not entirely sure yourself maybe how they're coming about? I just don't know how this works, you know, because this is such a certainty in your work, which is very different from writing that I know more about.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think some of the compositions that I made, the characters, like you mentioned, are not necessarily just like human as such. They have mutation. They are mutated. They are like hybrid creatures. Like I mentioned before, they're like kind of inspired by Octavia's work as well. But I think it's interesting to see like not just like characters as such, but also environments. Like, what if they're buildings, right? Or what if they're like spaceships? What if they're other forms of things that you recognize as essentially Tamilian or like South Asian? Like, what other things can we touch upon? But yeah, I think, yeah, it was interesting to have students kind of ask questions as well while I was painting. I think it's mostly because my work is like usually quite bright and it's hard to avoid, it's in
Mm.
face, which is good and bad. I hope that it's more attractive and that you get to like engage with it more. But yeah, it's always nice to create like in public so that you can talk a bit more about what do you think it means, or like where's it coming from. I see them
Oh,
like public art, for instance, like especially they have their own life. Like you can't like do anything about it once it's out in the world. It's just out. They are oftentimes like plastered on or graffitied on, and I welcome it. It's kind of cool to like collaborate um, with the environment that it exists in. So
mm.
yeah.
That's
Maybe we
interesting.
could
Yeah, yeah,
talk
because
about some of
yeah.
those.
No, you
Oh
go.
no, I was just going to say, maybe this is a good chance for us to talk about some of those public art murals that you've done previously. I was really interested just in researching your practice and how many of your residencies in particular have taken place within various locations in Southeast Asia and East Asia more widely. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the residency that you did at Jeju Island in South Korea.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite places to visit. Jeju is gorgeous. It's so beautiful. It's this island in South Korea. I was part of a residency called Museum Next Door, and essentially they had artists paint on like warehouses around the area, warehouses where farmers would store their like produce before they sold it in the market. Jeju in general has history of like the community being very closely connected to nature. They're predominantly, I believe, like farmers, like mandarin farmers, I think, and also have a history of like shamanism and being connected to the sea, right? And so, like most of my work, it's kind of site specific. So the mural itself is inspired by like the classical dances that exist in Jeju, and also Henyos, who are this like community of women divers in Jeju, like particularly in Jeju. And they're just like, they're incredible. They dive until they're like 60, 70 years old. They've been doing it for centuries. Like I said, they're predominantly women. They like free dive down to collect kind of like sea urchins and seaweed and, just insanely cool stuff. So it was interesting to see kind of this like matriarchal society that exists in Jeju, but which could be like different from like other parts of Korea and just Asia in general. I think predominantly a patriarchal society.
But also, there's some really interesting transnational connections there because you've also previously done public mural work in Chennai in India,
Yeah.
which has its own very specific relationship with fishing and agriculture.
Yeah,
Talk a bit about that one.
Exactly. So the one in Chennai is in Kannagi Nagar. It's called Providers and Protectors. So for that as well, I was inspired by like the fisher woman folk in Chennai. Excuse me. And similarly to the woman in Jeju, it's a woman that kind of like sell the fish and take care of like home and children and everything related to like family life, right? So it's cool to see a section of the society that's also very like matriarchal. Yeah, it's very cool how there's like connections between cultures, and like specific jobs that have different kind of like structures that exist within them.
It's interesting how, again, you know, with your kind of trademark style of drawing both on different, you know, different kind of histories, cultures, but also going back in history, but also going forward, right? That's a kind of what you do with this futuristic idea. I mean, because in that massive kind of mural that, you know, Josh just showed you, there is this crystal ball, right? Which, and somehow to me always seems to reflect the future in some way. Or am I getting this wrong? You know, because
No, you're completely right.
At the Nottingham Trent University one, and it's a really interesting way, I think, to kind of bring this idea of the future. And where did you get this idea, this ball? I mean, it looks very, yeah, I don't know. It's very much according to the witch iconography and so on, you know, soothsayers and so on, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the one in Chennai particularly, it has like sea inside, and the mural itself is called Providers and Protectors. So the idea behind that was to kind of show that the women are like taking care of the labor of everything related to the sea, and the fact that they're like protecting kind of the environment, like the space. That's where that comes from. But generally, yes, I do see globes and spheres as kind of looking into the future, what you would imagine the future to be like. Yeah, I tried to put kind of the past and the present and the future in like most of the work that I do. So it's nice that you picked up on that, and it's quite evident that it's like future facing.
And it's an interesting dialogue, isn't it? Because animals feature as well, and nature, right? I mean, and the trees and everything. It's not always clearly distinguishable what is what. And that, I think that's really interesting. It's just a very, yeah, it's quite a fluid world that you're envisaging.
I'd love to,
Also,
can we talk a bit about some of those hybrid animals? I'd love to see them.
Yeah. So in Karuppu in particular, which is a show that's happening at Bonington currently, and it's on till May 4th. Please visit. But yeah, there's lots of animals featured in that show. Like I mentioned before, most of them are already kind of like buffaloes, for instance, are a huge, iconic kind of symbol of Dalit culture. Because it has a lot to do with, like I mentioned before, the strata is so divided according to your jobs, right? And the upper castes, Brahmins, are considered pure because they're also vegetarian, and working with animals or eating animals have historically been people from the lower caste community because they can like afford to do so, and have also in case of like Adivasi community or tribals have lived in the forest, and so are like directly related to that. So that has a lot of like connotations of caste as well. But buffaloes, yeah, are also like visually dark, and I've been called like buffalo before because of the color of my skin, you know. So like it's a very like common kind of association with Dalit culture. So for me, it was interesting to kind of reclaim that into majestic kind of beasts and creatures that exist in this like new world. Same with rats, same with snakes, same with crows, for instance. Crows in permaculture is for us like the representation of our ancestors. So anytime we have like festivals or anything like that, we always like give a little bit of food to the crows. So yeah, for me, it was interesting to use that in my like compositions now as well. But yeah, it's interesting I think it's also a way of just kind of hoping for an integration of humans and our like environments and hopefully like project that into the future, you know, a more collaborative or inclusive, sustainable future. Yeah.
Do you draw ways on certain other Dalit cultural tropes, but potentially also Adivasi tropes? Because I've seen Adivasi art where, you know, humans and animals and plants are literally one being.
Yeah.
Something that you consciously draw on, because I always found those really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested in seeing, like, for instance, I feel like a lot of times when sci-fi is being imagined in the near future or far future, it's always very like clinical and very dystopian or like technologically just so machine related. For me, when I imagine my future, I want it to be more connected to nature, you know, like it's also, you're right, very much connected to or coming from like tribal lore and just yeah, just back home. Like I also come from a family of farmers. Like back in the day, my grandma and like great grandparents used to own like farming land, and that's how we like survived, you know. So it's cool to kind of see that, or hopefully see that in the world that I'm creating. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you brought up that. No, go on, Nicole.
Oh, I could talk forever, but usually Jelena, go on. I didn't want to.
No, I'm so interested in that because I remember, Osheen, you saying about how in the future you want to make even more of these hybrid animals, and especially something that crops up, I think, time and again in this exhibition is the lizard as the symbol of regeneration and renewal. But again, that's an animal that you talked about those different connotations. It's an animal that doesn't necessarily always get a good rep, for want of a better phrase. I was thinking about this. There's an exhibition that's just opened at Tate Modern about expressionism that is doing a really good job, I think, actually, of showing how expressionists based in Germany in particular were drawing on global and transnational networks and specifically motifs of spirituality. And there's a few paintings in there that feature tigers, and they show how tigers are, a symbol that we would have generally perceived in Western European art histories as this fierce, animalistic, ferocious figure. But in Buddhism, and that's what they were drawing on in these representations, it's a figure of compassion. And I wondered for you, because your work is exhibited not just in different media but so broadly globally, have people read into some of the symbols and the figures that you present differently?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that show sounds amazing. I will try and catch that.
We'll go.
Yeah. Awesome. But I think there are, like in Indian mythology, lots of hybrid animals and creatures that have existed in different cultures as well, right? So for instance, one of the artworks that are in the show is half fish. Oh no, not fish, sorry. Half rooster and half woman. And if I'm not mistaken, in like the Arabic culture, they've been kind of adopted into like queer resistance, because they represent like non-binariness, and hybridity is like a good metaphor to kind of represent that. Yeah, lizard is an interesting one because they're not necessarily in the Indian mythology, but it's such a common sight in all like Indian household, and they're always like shunned upon because they're just like falling on you all the time. But what was interesting to me is, you're completely right, the fact that they, like, when you cut their tails, they regenerate, right? Lizards have a capability of doing that. And like plant symbolism in my show is also representative of that, like regrowth and regeneration, and like this cyclical nature of earth, and yeah, just environment in general.
We also talk about, the kind of the beauty of the humans figures, human-like figures that you create, because they are often really, they're just so strong, and even and hybrid or not, they are strong. They're often really beautiful, often with more than one eye or yellow eyes, which is really interesting. But yes, when you create these figures of this kind of quite beautiful, quite welcoming future, I mean, where do they come from often? Do they just, yeah, I'm just wondering, what do you draw on to create individual figures, because they seem quite individualized, sometimes with portraits, don't we? And they all seem to have their own history. Do you make up a history for all these creatures and figures that you present?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intention for me is to just create a universe in which there are lots of creatures that exist, right? And there's lots of like environments and journeys that these creatures go through, but obviously are rooted in like the specific kind of Dalit and Tamil lens. But the colors that you brought up are taken kind of directly from Vellore, which is where I grew up, and we in Tamil Nadu, and we have this tendency of like really celebrating bright, clashy, contradictory, like complementary colors. And so that's being reflected in like everything around us, like our homes, for instance. Mine was like bright purple and my neighbor's home was like yellow, so it's very common for us to like associate bright colors with joy and like life in general. And I think like for instance, we're like frowned upon to wear black at celebratory kind of events, because it's just it for some reason represents like not like sadness for us. So yeah, I think the color aspect of it definitely like is reflected from like what I've just seen growing up. Yeah, sorry, what was the
Yeah, I'm just wondering where those
yeah,
it's just the grandeur of those figures, and the confidence of them and the beauty, right?
yeah.
The way they sometimes engage, when we have, the portraits. I just wonder how, when you create an individual figure, do you almost create like a biography for them, or
yeah,
how do you go about it? I'm just
yeah, I do try to imagine like what do they like, who are they as like creatures, right? What do they want to like represent, and what are they going through? Oftentimes in this like world, there may be traveling somewhere, or they have like a companion. Who are they friends with? One of the pieces in the show is this like series of women braiding each other's hair, and that was something that I've seen growing up. Like mom used to braid and oil my hair, and like my grandma did my mom's, and that was like an act of intimacy and care that was like passed down through generations. And it was like a good a practice, I guess, that I would see in the future, as like I would want to see in the future as well. So yeah, a lot of it is definitely picked from rituals or behavior that I've seen growing up, and a lot of creatures also very much inspired by like strong female characters that have existed in my life and I've gotten to know, throughout the years. And yeah, I just want to like embody or like show strong characters, like strength and resilience and solidarity in some ways.
And it feels really nice, because I felt like there is a story to them. I was just thinking, am I just making this? I'm just more used to stories, with a long narrative. But absolutely, I really can feel this narrative, that surrounds, that snapshot that you present us.
Yeah,
I think it's
one of the things that I would,
how you do that.
Yeah, and interesting that you say that, because I feel like one of the things that I would love to do in the future would also to be kind of incorporate literature and art. Like I would love to make graphic novel, for instance, or have animated like kind of film that has one clear like world building narrative that incorporates like language and music and visual language. But yeah, it would be cool to make it a bit more obvious, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Can I ask one more question that I think will bring us on nicely to
Yes.
to audience questions? You've spoken so much about your own background and, you know, basically mining your own archive, your own history. I know that you were born in Tamil Nadu in South India, but you're now based in Goa in West India. And in the middle, you also spent time in this universal township near Pondicherry, which I feel is a whole other story for a whole other time.
Oh my God, Orville,
we've
yes.
Yeah, which I feel like people should go away and research / we'll have a second talk about that in particular. But I wanted to ask how the movement between different spaces, and especially Goa, with having such a strong connection with the environment, has shaped your practice over time.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've always kind of moved around quite a bit throughout my life. Like for instance, my schooling was 1 year each school for the longest time until I went to high school. And I've moved out of home like during university, and I've just been like in different cities in India. Like home in Vellore and Goa is definitely very different. I think it also like reflects like growth in different environments for me. But yeah, Goa definitely is Goa is a very interesting place because it's very modern and yet very like traditional in some ways. But what I do definitely love about it is the fact that I'm very close to nature. Like I'm minutes away from the sea, and my house kind of, you know, I've been lucky to be in a house that is right next to a forest, so it really does like help in like creating my work in a peaceful way. Yeah. And yeah, being just closer to nature really helps. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting because although you have traveled a lot, it seems like a lot of your work, you mentioned about it being site specific, but there's always this effort to kind of connect with local communities as well. I know with some of your public artworks, the works themselves were sort of dismantled and reused by local communities and schools. And that lends in as well to everything you've been saying about these overlaps in your very interdisciplinary practice, even the fact that perhaps you've used spray cans for some of the backgrounds, right, for these paintings that are hanging in a more conventional arts exhibition space. So maybe we could talk a bit about your mural commission for Nottingham Trent University, because that's the newest part really of this exhibition and this collaboration.
Yeah.
And I know that someone has asked in the chat a question about colour. So maybe we could talk very particularly about the blue of the mural that's in the gallery space.
Oh yeah, definitely. So the show itself is, I mean, the inside of the gallery was being painted, or I did paint when we installed the show, because the name is called Karuppu, which translates to black in Tamil. Most of the gallery has been painted black, and there's been like I painted sorry, brain fog. Painted scenery with blue paint, and blue is very like particular to like the anti-caste movement and the Dalit community, mostly because our flag is blue, and the pioneer of the resistant movement, Ambedkar, it's closely related to him as well. Nobody actually knows where exactly it came from, but he also often wore blue suits, so we automatically kind of associate blue with him.
Right.
Yeah, and I think blue also kind of represents earth and sky, and hence have been adopted into like the Dalit anti-caste movement. So yeah, the color blue is very like intentionally included into the show. In terms of the mural commission, I was very happy to do that because it just seemed like an extension of the show itself at Bonington. The composition of the mural is kind of segregated into the main character, who's kind of looking into the future, and a crow that's looking back at her. The crow for me was a representation of the past, and the character holding the globe is kind of representation of the future. So it was cool to kind of extend Karuppu into like a neighboring space and in the same Nottingham Trent universe. Yeah.
It's also interesting that in some ways what is blue is also kind of black, isn't it, in theory, because the crow is blue on the mural and the hair that you paint is often blue, when somehow I also assume it's black at the same time. Right, so it's an interesting how it kind of goes in and out of. You see the colors even quite differently, and I mean the crow is also massive, isn't it? And I mean it's just as big as this other figure, and they look at each other with their intriguingly yellow eyes. And we could talk about colors forever, but I think it'll take us somehow slightly in a different direction. But I really want to kind of ask this question by Purna Chandra Naik, who's kindly asked the question and put it in the chat. So I think I'm really quite keen, and in some ways full circle to where we started. So Purna Chandra Naik, who just recently got his PhD from Nottingham Trent, so it's
amazing.
It's just lovely. Yeah, lovely to see your name there, Purna. So the question is, there is increasing resistance to any kind of discussion about caste in the West by the upper caste Indian diaspora. Given your international outreach and the current conservative political context in India, how has your work been received internationally? Has there been any kind of backlash against you or your work by upper castes in India or abroad?
That's a good question. I think I'm only, so in terms of showing in an international space, this is my first show in the UK, so it's gone great so far. I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I've also mostly kind of worked in collaboration with like brands and organizations and people that are very clearly in the same space as me. So it's been okay so far, but it is kind of scary to work in like an anti-caste space, and back home, especially when things are a bit volatile like it is now. I myself, luckily enough, haven't necessarily encountered anything too drastic, but I do have friends that they've made like illustration commissions and have been doxxed, or being trolled on the internet, or famously one of the comic strip illustrators in India was taken to the Supreme Court, for talking against the government. So, and we have lots of protesters and leaders in anti-caste space that have been jailed over the years, so it's not to be taken lightly. But I think because I work in kind of a space that is generally shown to kind of the youth of India and abroad, generally it's very welcoming and encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wonder whether that's maybe the style in which you create.
Yeah, that I'm sure
right?
Plays a role.
Yeah, because it's kind of quite welcoming, and it doesn't. Yeah, it's anti-caste if you explain it, right? But as you said in the intro, right, some people might just find their way into it, and see it in a potentially quite depoliticized way, right?
Yeah.
You almost need to have the narrative around it, right, to politicize it as such, right? But we've been talking about narrative, right, and how paintings, create their own narrative, or it's up to the viewer. And we have one question which says, in the animal paintings, do you try to tell their stories, or leave it up to the interpretation by the audience?
I think it's a bit of both. I intend it to be something, but I'm also open to it being interpreted in different ways. I think that's one of the good things and the tricky part about visual language, right? It doesn't necessarily have, or let me put it this way, it has the space and the flexibility for you to kind of see it in a different way. But as long as you kind of read the description and the intention behind it, you can take it in different like journeys. I think it's also because not like one particular character or animals doesn't necessarily have a full-blown story arc. They all kind of live in this universe. So it's nice for people to kind of imagine their individual journeys themselves, but know where they're like situated, you know?
And it's the dialogues you create as well, right? I mean, because when you are in the exhibition space, in this beautiful room, right, with the black background and the blue paintings on top, it really feels very much like universe. And I've seen people, especially at the opening when there were so many people milling about, people feel quite, I think people really want to create their own story in dialogue with the paintings as well, right? Which I think is absolutely fine, because in some ways those figures, they look distinct, they're very much your style, but at the same time, they also seem quite welcoming and kind of oddly familiar, even though I've never quite seen anything like it, which is lovely.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. Do we have more questions?
I wonder whether I don't, do we?
Oh,
not
okay.
in the chat, not I don't think so. But we could, I think we wanted to kind of keep it to this hour-long talk, but I have a feeling we'll do this again in the near future, right, Jelena?
I would love to.
we have a follow-up at some point.
I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. But I think it's yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jelena, for coming and joining us in this beautiful talk. And Osheen, it's great to have you back. And it's I really seen your work develop so much the last time that we met you kind of online, and it's been so wonderful to see your paintings sort of properly face to face, and even see them being created, in that mural at Nottingham Trent University. Yeah, so it's been a real honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really lovely. And thank you. And thank you, Bonington Gallery. Yes, thank you. Just doing all the work in the background. Thank you. Well, thank you. Excellent. Until we see you again. And maybe one plug, we'll have a workshop with Osheen next week on the 1st of May. So if anyone's interested, at the Bonington Gallery website, you can have a look, and you might want to join us, in creating your own Dalit futures.